A New York appeals court voided the nearly $500 million civil fraud judgment against President Trump. The case brought by the state's attorney general accused Trump and his family real estate business of inflating his net worth for better loan terms. Today's decision still leaves the president liable for fraud. The judges agreed to uphold Trump's liability, but said the almost $5 million fine was excessive and violates the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, so this is massive, and I need you to understand just how bad this is for Donald Trump, because his last legal strategy just completely collapsed. Appeals courts just ruled against him, multiple appeals courts, on multiple cases, all at once, and every single ruling went against Trump. His tariff authority struck down, his emergency powers claims rejected. His presidential immunity arguments denied. Everything gone. And here's what that means. The door to prison just opened. Like actually opened. Not hypothetically, not maybe someday. Right now. Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts in New York, the hush money case. We all know about it. Stormy Daniels, Michael Cohen, the whole thing. And Trump's been fighting sentencing ever since, using every legal maneuver possible, claiming presidential immunity, claiming he can't be sentenced while in office. But appeals courts just shut all of that down. They said no, presidential immunity doesn't apply here. You can be sentenced. You will be sentenced. And unless the Supreme Court steps in with an emergency intervention, which they've already declined to do once, Trump's going to face consequences. Real consequences. Not just fines, not just probation. We're talking about the possibility of actual prison time for a sitting president. Can you believe this? We might be about to watch a president go to prison. That's never happened in American history. Never. But it's about to happen now, because Trump's final legal shields just got ripped away, and the courts are saying, you're not above the law. You don't get special treatment because you're president. You were convicted by a jury. You're going to be sentenced like anyone else. Now, here's what makes this even crazier. It's not just a criminal case. Trump lost on his policy cases too. Federal Circuit Appeals Court ruled in August 2025 that Trump's tariffs were unconstitutional, that he exceeded his presidential authority by imposing them. They called it a major questions doctrine violation, said Trump can't just claim emergency powers to bypass Congress on trade policy. That's the tariff policy we've been talking about. The one generating hundreds of billions in revenue. The one Trump promised to use for dividend checks. The courts just said it's illegal. All of it. Has to be unwound. Companies get refunds. The whole system collapses. And Trump's deportation strategy also struck down. He tried to use the Alien Enemies Act to justify mass detentions, to deport people without hearings. Appeals courts said no. There's no invasion or predatory incursion as required by law. You can't just declare an emergency and start detaining people. So Trump's losing on every front. Criminal convictions, civil cases, policy decisions, emergency powers. Everything he's tried, courts are shutting down. And here's what's really devastating. These are appeals court decisions. These are the courts that review lower court rulings, the final stop before the Supreme Court. So Trump's already lost at the trial level, lost at the appeals level, and now his only hope is the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court already refused to halt his sentencing once. They let the lower court ruling stand. They didn't intervene. So why would they intervene now? Why would they suddenly decide to save Trump when they've already declined to do so? They might not. They probably won't. Which means Trump's out of options, out of legal moves, out of ways to avoid consequences. And the consequences are real. Prison time is on the table, not just for show, not just a threat. Actually possible, actually likely, according to some legal experts. A sitting president behind bars. That's where we might be heading. That's what these appeals court rulings just made possible. If you want to understand why Trump's legal strategy just collapsed and what it means for his presidency, hit that subscribe button right now. Because we're about to break down every failed legal argument, what the appeals courts actually ruled, and why Trump might actually face prison time while serving as president. Alright, so let's dig into what actually happened, because Trump lost on multiple fronts simultaneously, and each loss is significant on its own. Together, they're devastating. First, the tariff case. This is huge, because Trump's entire economic agenda has been built around tariffs, imposing them, collecting revenue, using that money for political promises. But the Federal Circuit Appeals Court ruled in August 2025 that Trump exceeded his authority, that his tariffs violate the Constitution and statutory limits. The court said Trump was using emergency powers inappropriately, that there wasn't a real emergency justifying the tariffs, that he was stretching the law beyond recognition, and they invoked the major questions doctrine. That's a legal principle that says presidents can't make huge policy changes without clear congressional authorization. Trade policy affecting hundreds of billions of dollars, that's a major question. And Congress never authorized Trump to impose these specific tariffs, so the court struck them down, said they're illegal, said companies deserve refunds, said the whole system has to be unwound. That's the $3 trillion unwind Trump was warning about. Except now it's not a warning, it's reality, it's happening. Because the appeals court ruled, and unless the Supreme Court overturns that ruling, Trump's tariffs are done, finished, gone. Second, the Alien Enemies Act case. Trump tried to use this old law from the 1700s to justify mass detentions and deportations. The law allows presidents to detain or deport foreign nationals during times of war or invasion. But there has to be an actual invasion or predatory incursion by a foreign government. Trump claimed the border situation constitutes an invasion, that unauthorized immigration is a predatory incursion, that he can use these emergency powers. The appeals court said absolutely not. That's not what the law means. Immigration, even illegal immigration, isn't an invasion in the legal sense. You can't just declare an emergency and start rounding people up without hearings, without due process, without following normal procedures. So Trump's aggressive deportation strategy, based on illegal interpretation of the law, has to be stopped. Can't continue without proper legal authority. Third, and this is the big one, the criminal conviction appeals. Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts in New York, falsifying business records, the hush money case, and Trump's been fighting sentencing by arguing presidential immunity, saying you can't sentence a sitting president, that it would interfere with his duties. His lawyers took this argument to federal court, to New York state courts, all the way up the chain, and every court said no. Presidential immunity doesn't apply to criminal convictions for conduct that happened before you were president. For personal misconduct unrelated to official duties, Trump wasn't acting as president when he paid hush money to Stormy Daniels in 2016. He was a private citizen, a candidate, not the president. So presidential immunity doesn't protect him from those charges, doesn't prevent sentencing, doesn't shield him from consequences. The appeals courts were unanimous on this. Every judge who reviewed it agreed. Trump doesn't get special treatment. And then Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, asked them to halt the sentencing, to give him emergency protection. And the Supreme Court said no, denied his request, let the lower court ruling stand, allowed sentencing to proceed. That was in January 2025, right before Trump took office. The court already decided this issue, already ruled against Trump. So why would they change their minds now? Why would they suddenly intervene when they've already declined to do so? They probably won't, which means Trump's going to be sentenced. And when you're convicted on 34 felony counts, prison time is a real possibility. Now, let's talk about what sentencing could actually look like, because there is a range of possibilities, not all of them involve prison. On the low end, probation, fines, community service, suspended sentence. Trump stays out of prison but has to comply with court orders. That's what some legal experts think is most likely. Judges are usually reluctant to imprison first-time offenders on white-collar crimes, and sending a sitting president to prison, that's unprecedented. Creates massive practical problems, security, governance, international implications. So maybe the judge shows mercy, gives Trump a lenient sentence, avoids the chaos of imprisoning a president. But on the high end, actual prison time. Maybe not decades, but months or years in a federal facility under guard. Some legal experts think the judge might do this to send a message, to show that even presidents face consequences, to uphold the rule of law. And the crimes Trump was convicted of, they are serious. 34 counts. Systematic falsification of records, cover-up of election interference. The judge could reasonably conclude that probation isn't sufficient, that accountability requires actual incarceration. So we are in this bizarre situation where a sitting president might go to prison while still serving as president, still commander-in-chief. How would that even work? Would Trump govern from a cell? Would the vice president take over temporarily? Would Trump resign? Nobody knows, because it's never happened. We are in completely uncharted territory. The Constitution doesn't address this scenario. And that uncertainty, that's what makes this so dangerous. Not just for Trump, for the entire country, for our system of government. Because we are about to stress test our institutions in ways we've never done before, and we don't know if they can handle it. Fourth, the broader pattern. Trump's not just losing one case, he's losing everything. Every legal strategy he's tried has failed. Presidential immunity? Rejected. Emergency powers? Struck down. Appeals to delay? Denied. Supreme Court intervention? Declined. The courts are sending a consistent message. Trump is not above the law. He has to follow the same rules as everyone else. And that's historic, because presidents typically have enormous protection, broad immunity, deference from courts. But Trump's conduct was so egregious, his legal arguments so weak, that courts aren't giving him that deference. They are treating him like any other criminal defendant. And when you're convicted on 34 felony counts, that's bad news. Okay, so let's break down what this means going forward. Because we're entering completely unprecedented territory, nobody knows what happens next. First, the immediate question: what happens when Trump gets sentenced? Does he actually go to prison, or does the judge show mercy? Legal experts are genuinely divided. Some think the judge will avoid prison because of the complications. Others think accountability requires it. My guess: the judge gives Trump some prison time but suspends most of it. Maybe orders a few months in minimum security, makes a statement but doesn't cripple the presidency. But even that would be historic. Even a day in prison for a sitting president would be unprecedented, would change everything. Second, the political fallout. If Trump goes to prison, even briefly, Republicans will lose their minds. They'll call it a political prosecution. They'll say Democrats weaponize the justice system. They'll demand investigations, impeachment, retaliation against Democratic officials. And Trump's base? They'll see him as a martyr, as proof the system is rigged against them, as validation of every conspiracy theory they believe. That could actually strengthen Trump politically, make him more popular with his core supporters, fuel his grievance narrative. But with moderates, with independents, seeing the president in prison would be devastating, would damage Republican prospects massively. So politically, this is a disaster for Republicans, but it might help Trump personally within his base. Third, the governance crisis. How do you run a country when the president is in prison, even if it's just for a few months? The vice president could take over temporarily under the 25th Amendment, but Trump would have to voluntarily transfer power. Would he do that? Or would he refuse, try to govern from prison, create a constitutional crisis where there are competing claims to presidential authority? Congress could force a 25th Amendment transfer, but that requires 2/3 of both houses. That's not happening with Republicans in control. So we might end up in this absurd situation where Trump is technically president but can't actually perform presidential duties because he is incarcerated. And meanwhile, the country needs leadership. The military needs a commander-in-chief. Foreign policy needs direction. It would be governmental chaos, uncertainty everywhere, allies questioning our stability, enemies seeing opportunity. Fourth, the Supreme Court wildcard. Trump's final hope is that the Supreme Court intervenes, grants emergency relief, halts sentencing. They've already declined once, but maybe they reconsider. Maybe they decide the consequences are too severe. Maybe they find a way to save Trump. The court has 3 Trump appointees, 6 conservative justices total. They could potentially rescue him if they wanted to, but they'd have to overturn their previous decision, reverse the appeals court unanimously, create new law to protect Trump. That would be naked partisanship, would destroy the court's credibility, make them look like Trump's personal legal defense team. Most observers think the court won't do it, won't risk their institutional legitimacy to save Trump from consequences of his own actions. But we can't rule it out. This court has surprised us before, and they might surprise us again. Fifth, the tariff collapse. Even if Trump somehow avoids prison, his tariff policy is dead. Appeals courts killed it. That means no more tariff revenue, no dividend checks, no $3 trillion in projected collections. The whole economic strategy collapses, and companies want refunds, hundreds of billions in refunds. That comes out of the federal budget. That increases the deficit massively. So Trump's facing economic crisis on top of legal crisis. His signature policy struck down, his revenue source eliminated, his promises broken. That's politically devastating heading into 2026 elections. Democrats will hammer him. Say he promised checks but couldn't deliver. Say his policies were illegal all along. Say he's been lying to voters about his economic achievements. Sixth, what this means for presidential power. These appeals court rulings establish new limits on what presidents can do. They can't use emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional authorization. They can't use old laws to justify mass detentions. They can't claim immunity from criminal prosecution for personal misconduct. They have to follow the law like everyone else. That's good for democracy, good for checks and balances, good for the rule of law. But it's also a major reduction in presidential authority. Future presidents will have less flexibility, less ability to act unilaterally, more constraints on their power. Some people will celebrate that. Others will say it makes the presidency too weak. The presidents need discretion to respond to crisis. But either way, these rulings are reshaping the presidency, redefining its limits, and Trump is the unfortunate test case. Look, the bottom line is this. Appeals courts rejected Trump's tariff authority, emergency powers claims, and presidential immunity arguments, with the Federal Circuit calling his tariffs unconstitutional and courts denying his attempts to avoid sentencing for his 34 felony convictions. The Supreme Court already refused to halt Trump's sentencing once in January 2025, making it unlikely they'll intervene now, and leaving Trump with no remaining legal shields against imprisonment. These rulings don't just affect Trump's criminal case, they also struck down his deportation strategy using the Alien Enemies Act and collapsed his entire tariff-based economic agenda worth potentially trillions. This opens the very real possibility of a sitting president facing prison time while in office, creating an unprecedented constitutional crisis with no clear roadmap for how governance would work. So here's my final question for you. Should Trump face prison time for his felony convictions even though he is a sitting president, or are there legitimate reasons to suspend sentencing until after his term ends? And more broadly, are these appeals court rulings appropriately limiting presidential power or dangerously weakening the executive branch? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is literally about whether presidents are above the law and whether our system can handle imprisoning a sitting commander-in-chief. And make sure you're subscribed, because as sentencing approaches and these legal battles continue, you need to understand what's at stake for Trump, the presidency, and American democracy. Don't miss the coverage.